So this is a drive I did through Ypsilanti, Michigan. Hope I'm saying that right. It ranks top 10 to top 15 depending on which list you look at and what statistics you're using in most dangerous cities in Michigan. The population's about 19,000 and it's declining. It's 58% white, 22% black, 7% Hispanic, and 5% Asian, so it's fairly diverse. The average age is 26, which is really young. 11% of the adults are seniors, and that's also a low number of seniors. And they have a 33.6% homeownership rate, which is very low and probably is a contributing factor to the fact that they have higher crime. Because people who don't have a stake in the city they live in don't care as much about the area, and you tend to have more crime. And that just goes along with, if the home ownership was even 50%, this would be a much safer city. Not saying it would be safe, but it would be much safer because you'd have a larger percent of the people that, had some kind of stake in their area and they, want it to be better. The average income is $38,000 a year, and there's a 27% poverty rate. So more than 1 in every 4 people that live there live below the poverty line. The marriage rate is also really low at 22%. Typically in these bad cities, it's at least up in the 30s, maybe upper 30s. And I've seen it as low as 19. I think that was Gary, Indiana, I think was 19. I might be remembering that wrong, but that one was really low too. But 22% is really low. And 62% of the people that lived there were born there. And it's showing that 90% of the people that lived there were native-born people that were born in America. And only 5% is what it's showing for people that are non-citizens. And I don't know how far back these statistics go on where the people are from. I imagine it's at least a year old because they update it once a year, so it's probably at least a year or could be as much as a year old. But to know the non-citizen count in a city, you have to have people admitting they are non-citizens. And so when it says 5%, it's likely much higher than that. They have, for the most part, less than 5 homicides per year. And because of the size of the population, that gives them murder rates typically between 10 and 20. So Chicago's murder rate is 22. So on a bad year there where they have 5 homicides, their murder rate is the same as Chicago's. Now obviously they have far less homicides than Chicago has, but because of their size, if you do it on per capita, 5 homicides there is almost the same as the hundreds that they have in Chicago. The assault rates jumped to over 1,000 per 100,000 people in 2020. And that's higher than Baltimore. Baltimore's at just over 900. So having an assault rate over 1,000 is really bad. Because, Baltimore is bad. Baltimore ranks up there bad. Detroit is something like 1,600, so it's nowhere near Detroit levels, but it's higher than Baltimore, which we all know Baltimore is not a safe city. And their theft rate is another one that's really high, and that one's in the 2,000s per 100,000 people. That's really high. So their violent crime is 186% worse than the national average, 186% higher than the national average. And typically, I gauge this at anything that's around 100 or 80, 90, 100 in that area. I would just call that regular city bad. You're going to have a level of crime that you live in a city. So there's a certain level that you're going to expect just from living in city limits. And this is 186. So this is starting to get up into that iffier. When you hit 200% higher, this is 186. When you start hitting that 200% higher, you start getting into that iffier category where you really got to be paying attention to what's going on around you. Your odds of becoming a victim of a crime is 1 in 26. And they're showing actually a year-over-year decrease in crime of 2%, which is pretty good. So that means they either just had a really good year last year and it's down a little bit this year, or, 2% isn't that much. But it's at least a movement in the right direction. If it's something they can sustain for multiple years, it would make a difference. The cost of living is right around the national average. And housing is actually 14% lower than the national average. So if the housing was more expensive than the national average, it would make sense that they have a low homeownership rate. But the housing is actually cheaper. So, they should be like 50% or higher of homeownership rates with how much cheaper the housing is there than it is across the country. But they don't. They, are in the 30% range. What did I say it was? Yeah, 33.6% homeownership rate. It's really low. Even for a bad city, that's really low. So the schools are where things tell you if a city has hope for the future or not, or if they're just going to continue down a downward path. And 34% of the students that graduate are proficient at reading and math. 34%. Basically, 1 out of every 3 students graduates proficient at reading and math. And 42% for Michigan as a state. The national average is 48%. So basically less than 50% in the US graduate proficient at reading and math. 42%, so even less than the abysmal US average, is Michigan, and well below that is 34% for the city of Ypsilanti. 90%, however, have completed the 8th grade. That number is really high. It doesn't sound high, but that's a really high number for America, to have 90% of the kids complete the 8th grade in cities across America, and 88% have graduated high school. So they're graduating, they're just not graduating very smart. So there's a little hope in the fact that they graduate the kids, but they must just push them on through and pass them on through, because they're not learning anything when they're there. 34% is horrible. 42% for the state of Michigan is horrible. 48% for the US is really horrible. But 34%, that's, it's bad.